You won't believe what this hedge fund wizard is predicting for the future of the economy. Spoiler alert, it's not a good prediction. We're talking about Micheal Burry, the guy who stunned the world with his spot-on prediction of the US housing market's collapse in 2008. And in February 2021, he warned of a major inflation surge in the US, despite inflation rates remaining under 2%. Once again, he has proven himself right. This financial wizard has made several other accurate predictions, but his latest one is a game changer. Brace yourself, because if he ends up being right, we're in front of an economic earthquake. So stay tuned to discover Burry's outlook for 2023, because it's a bombshell that could shake the world of finance to its core. As usual, Micheal Burry has been on a Twitter rampage making waves with his predictions for the economy. And on January 2nd, Burry updated us with his thoughts on what the economic environment will look like over the next few years. And what he had to say is quite alarming. According to Burry, while inflation has peaked, it's not the last peak of this cycle. He predicts that the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, will decrease, possibly resulting in negative CPI in the second half of 2023. Additionally, he forecasts that the United States will enter a recession by any definition. Burry also predicts that the Federal Reserve will cut interest rates and the government will implement stimulus measures. He warns that these actions will lead to another surge in inflation, which could be even worse than what we are seeing now. What Burry is essentially predicting is that the current downtrend in inflation we are seeing is simply the end of the first wave of inflation. He believes that over the next few years we will likely see more waves of inflation because the Federal Reserve will lack the willpower to keep rates high and crush inflation once and for all. Undoubtedly, this possible situation sends shivers down the spine of investors. This is due to the fact that this is the same scenario that occurred in the 1970s. But before we dive into what happened in the 1970s, let's first understand what's going on currently. So, what's the state of the macroeconomy in the United States? Over the past few years, the US has faced a combination of supply chain issues and money printing, which have resulted in inflation soaring to the highest level in 4 decades. This has put the Federal Reserve in a difficult position, forcing them to step in to raise the interest rates to slow down the economy and rein in spending. It's a balancing act between allowing inflation to run rampant and raising interest rates, which causes financial hardship for citizens and businesses. Although raising interest rates can help curb inflation, it can also put a strain on people. High interest rates mean that mortgages, personal loans, and other debts consume a large portion of disposable income, leaving little to spend on other necessities. However, the Fed has made the decision to raise rates to 4.5% from 0, and inflation is beginning to trend down as a result. Despite this, there is a lot of political pressure to lower interest rates as it makes people feel better, and politicians want to keep their constituents happy. However, lowering rates too soon could cause inflation to ramp up again, leading us back to square one. Unfortunately, this was the same situation that played out in the 1970s. Now, let's step back in time and explore the Great Inflation of the 1970s. The Great Inflation of the 1970s was a tumultuous time in American economic history. It was a period marked by high unemployment, soaring prices, and declining purchasing power. The once mighty dollar was losing its value, and people were struggling to make ends meet. The situation was dire, and the Federal Reserve was struggling to find a solution. Inflation began to rear its ugly head in the late 1960s, and by the early 1970s it had become a full-blown crisis. The price of goods and services was skyrocketing, and interest rates were soaring. The Fed tried to control the situation by raising interest rates, but it was like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. Inflation continued to climb, and the Fed was forced to take drastic measures. Paul Volcker, who was appointed as the chairman of the Fed in 1979, was the man who finally conquered inflation. He raised interest rates to a staggering 20%, which sent the US into a harsh recession. But his actions paid off, and inflation finally began to cool off. Fast forward to the present day, and once again, the specter of inflation is rearing its head. Micheal Burry, a famed investor, is warning that history may repeat itself. He predicts that inflation will calm down, but interest rates will remain high, which could lead the US into another recession. Politicians may pressure the Fed to lower interest rates, which could then trigger the next inflation wave. Now, I'd like you to pay close attention and listen to this.
Our thoughts on the inflationary environment, and please compare and contrast it to the 1970s.
Well, when Volcker, after the 70s, took the prime rate to 20% and the government was paying 15% on its government bonds, that was a horrible recession. Lasted a long time, caused a lot of agony. And I certainly hope we're not going there again. I think the conditions that allowed Volcker to do that without an interference from the politicians were very unusual. And I think in 2020 hindsight, it was a good thing that he did it. I would not predict that our modern politicians will be as willing to permit a new Volcker to get that tough with the economy and bring on that kind of a recession. So I think the new troubles are likely to be different from the old troubles.
This is related. These are all.
You may wish you had a Volcker. You may wish you had a Volcker-style recession.
Interestingly, Burry isn't the only notable investor to express this opinion. Charlie Munger, who you definitely know, also believes that the Fed's willpower won't be strong enough to conquer inflation. These two well-known investors, Micheal Burry and Charlie Munger, are simply expressing doubts that the Federal Reserve has the necessary political support to take the tough measures that would be needed to get inflation under control. The reason being that unless inflation fluctuates enough to create a cycle where the Fed is forced to raise interest rates again and again, their plan may not work. They are also of the belief that the political environment that enabled Paul Volcker to conquer inflation in the 1970s might not be present today. However, the Federal Reserve has reiterated their commitment to ensuring that a repeat of the 1970s inflation does not occur. Chairman Jerome Powell recognizes the economic turbulence of that era and promises to keep inflation in check. But words are not enough. And Micheal and Munger have raised their concerns that the lack of political willpower and follow-through from the Fed could once again lead to disastrous consequences. They are not convinced that the Fed's commitment to keeping inflation under control will be enough. They believe that the Fed may want to bring inflation down to an acceptable level, but the reality is that it may not be possible due to political pressures. Despite the Fed's assurances, Burry's opinion still holds water, and the question remains, will the Fed have the courage to confront inflation head-on and prevent a repeat of the 1970s? Or will we witness a return to those dark days of economic uncertainty as Micheal Burry predicted? The answer to that question remains elusive, leaving us all to wonder what the future holds. But if you want to know about how to navigate the current financial landscape, watch our next video about how to achieve a 66% return per year by Jim Simmons. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.